Alrighty. Well, Anna, welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Erica. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on. I know we've connected online a lot, and then we met at Podcast Movement Evolutions in Vegas for the first time. So it was great actually meeting you in person, hanging out, and getting to know you on a more personal level. But the first question I have is, so where are you originally from?
Yeah, so I feel like you're one of those people. And by the way, before I even get into me, like I would love to say that I love your content online. I think that I always tell people, stop using social media as a promotional tool for your podcast and start connecting with people, because you're in LA, I'm in Dallas, Texas, and we've been connected for, I would say, probably like a year now. And we got to meet and it felt like it wasn't odd at all. So like for that, I'm so grateful for social media. But yeah, just wanted to like put it out there first.
Yeah, well, it's funny too, because as podcasters, like, you know, and just nowadays in society in general, there's so much like social media, and you feel kind of connected to the people, but it's also like there's so much distance. And I think as podcasters, the whole point of podcasting is to connect with people. So I think it's great to get to know you and actually, have that face-to-face connection. Because I know a lot of us, whether we're working solo or a lot of us are working remote. So it is nice to have that interaction.
Yeah, same thing. Yes. So let's get into me.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more about you. Yeah.
Yeah, like I guess I can call myself a little bit a citizen of the world. So I'm originally from Portugal. Lived in London, and then, typical story, girl meets boy, boy's about to leave, boy's moving to the US, and girl's like, I kind of I'm over Portugal by now and London. I want to go somewhere else. And it was perfect, kind of like the leap of faith that everybody talks about. And personally, I'm so risk averse. So I'm still surprised that I did it. But yeah, I love it. I love the US. People are amazing. And so it's funny because when you start, and that's another thing about podcasting, is just you get to meet people. You just kind of create a foundation for anything you want, right? And it can take you anywhere. So I would just say, moving countries, a podcast is a great opportunity to extend your network. But do you want me to go a bit deeper into like who I am and all of that?
Yeah, well, let's well, first of all, I think that's awesome. I think I'm jealous that you actually got to move. Well, you moving here, I've always dreamed about, and it could still happen at some point. Yeah, like at least doing maybe like a summer in Europe, like 3 full months, or because I think you just get like a change of perspective and a change of pace. And coming here for you is probably really exciting. But yeah, I would love. Never been to Portugal or London. I've been to several other countries in Europe, but yeah, and I think that kind of just shapes who you are and culturally, and so coming here and bringing that with you. That's really cool.
Yeah, so I started in Portugal. I did a journalism degree in communication, so I got to understand not just how to write for, like print and radio and like all of that, but also PR and multimedia. And I think that was so important for me to become who I am today, because I was just like, okay, like if I am pitching, my own podcast to a journalist, I know how to do it. And I think that so many podcasters think that their skill set is just like static. So like at some point in my career in London, I was, waiting tables, or I was front of house, just serving people and taking orders and whatever. Like that shaped me to become a really good customer service person and making everybody feel like super welcomed, especially when you're going into a studio. Cause at some point, I was a podcast producer for, live podcasts, and some people are great when they first go into, a place that they don't know. But some people are so nervous. And if you can make them feel at home and excited to be there and just super pumped to start recording and not feel nervous, is just so important. And as a host, you really need to get your guests kind of on a good mindset. Once you hit record, it flows totally differently. So I think that understanding also moving countries, people are so different, and working with, people in the UK and especially London is almost like a melting pot, right? You have people from everywhere in the world. And yeah, just like I speak multiple languages. So I speak Portuguese, Spanish, French, I can kind of gauge Italian, but it also in English, obviously. But you kind of understand that the way that people think is different. Mm-hmm. And you also have a lot of compassion for interviewing people who are foreigners or people who are just from a different culture. And when we are in our own bubble, sometimes we can feel, I don't know, we're not that aware of cultural differences or just how to position our questions in a way that is clear. And so, yeah, like in my own podcast, I always try to say a word and then hang on, are my listeners, because my listeners are from, a little here and there. So everywhere from the planet. And then, yeah, just sometimes I'm like, will they know this? Let me just like use a different word, just like right, at the back of that to make sure that everybody gets it. So I think that you bring a little kind of like a more worldly view of like what podcasting is. And also for your listeners, you're thinking maybe not everyone knows this.
No, I love that. I think too, like, yeah, just that background that you have probably coming here and eventually getting into like entrepreneurship, which we'll get more into later in the show. But yeah, it just teaches you how to deal, like you said, with like different personalities, and just know how to connect with people from different backgrounds. Cause I think that can be challenging and making people feel welcome, which is really important. So the fact that you have that, I think is rad. So, okay, background in journalism, perfectly like setting yourself up eventually for podcasting, which you probably maybe knew at the time or maybe didn't know at the time. But I guess you launched a podcast in 2008.
Yeah. So actually, when we were, so it's so funny because at the time we didn't really call it podcast, but like exactly all the steps that you did were like what you do for a podcast. So we didn't really have a radio station. Most journalism like schools, they have kind of like a closed circuit for radio stations, but just the building that we were in was kind of all, again, Europe. All right. And so they didn't have the capabilities to like really run a system throughout the whole building. And so they did, what a podcast would be. So you had like, you could sign up using, the RSS feed and all of that. So we used to kind of like do the typical, like it was, almost like documentary kind of some features. It were shows that were, I think it was like twice a month, but it's just like writing show notes, thinking about the title, like cover art, all the things. And so to think about doing podcasting like in 2008 and doing it today, when people are like, podcasting there's so many moving parts. There are, yes, not saying there aren't, but today we have so many tools that provide you an opportunity to start with minimal knowledge on, audio engineering. And then they can talk to people like you when they're like on the next step. But that is not a barrier to starting. If you, back in the like 2-3 years ago before like on Anchor, you edited the waveform. So you weren't really like, or the text, the waveform, I don't know anymore. I don't remember because I never used it. People were like, I love Anchor. And I was like, Anchor. I'm not.
I never used it. I remember I edited early days of Anchor. They didn't actually become clients, but I did like 1 or 2 episodes for them. And it was so like out of sync and just, it was like a nightmare. And they're like, we used Anchor. And I know Anchor was back then, they might still be, I don't know, trying to position themselves as like a Riverside. It was like an all-in-one thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, yeah.
Yeah. And to me, there were people that were doing it like in a very safe way. It worked out, but people were like trying to mix like tracks under their like voiceover, and it was always like the worst because I cannot hear you. The music is so loud. So anyway, they could still get it out and, like not a problem. But I feel like great ideas were born and then improved just because people were like, oh, okay, like even though I'm not a journalist, I'm not a producer, I can do it. And just quickly touching on like, why am I not a journalist today? Like one, because during my internship, right before finishing my journalism degree, my mentor was like, Ana, I think you have too much energy to deliver news. You're holding in so much personality. I think you should really look into doing like some DJing or like voiceovers. And like, you know what? I always felt that. So I am so grateful for him to be truly honest with me and just say, hey, like you can go down that path, but I think that you should try something else. So that's exactly what I did. I went into a small town radio station, and I had the afternoon show, so I experimented so much. They trusted me with so much that I'm like,
yo, so
how was that possible?
You were the host of that. That's cool.
Yeah.
And that is in English or Portuguese?
It was in Portuguese.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And like about a year after that, my best friend's like, Anna, I got accepted in this illustration school in London. Do you want to come with me? And I was like, the land of the BBC? Heck yes. And so I started looking into like different schools, and there was a music production school that had an advanced radio production course. And I was like, oh, it's just 3 months. Worst case scenario. Again, my risk averse person, it's just 3 months. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. And yeah, a month in, I was like, I love London. This is amazing. And so I stayed. I was able to collaborate on a lot of really cool projects, but everyone has the same idea as you. So it's really hard to get into radio. But I learned about something that I want to talk about, which is hospital radio and community radio.
Okay. Let's hear it. I'm not familiar.
Yes. So not a lot of people are, but I think that is really interesting because it just helps you understand. Online radio back in 2011 was huge, right? That was like something that got people migrating into podcasting really quickly. And hospital radio is a closed circuit radio. So it's made for the patients of the hospital. So it's run by volunteers. So hosts are volunteers, people who are like going around the floors, people who are like bedridden. They take their requests, they talk to them, they hear their stories, and then they take it to the hosts, and then they like talk about like, oh, Sue, who is, on the 9th floor, she is requesting whatever song because, it was a childhood song that she loved. So it's how cool is that? And I think that I took all of that understanding of, online radio and hospital radio and community radio into my career because there's so many different ways to do podcasting and merge all of these concepts that I don't think enough people know. And I'm just like, this is so cool. But, so having that understanding, and then we got to like collaborate with museums and all of that to do, outside broadcasts. So we would like set up a mini studio and we would like talk to residents and collect things for a museum and then for like the local officials. And it was just so cool. Like that kind of thing. Today, I think it was so ahead of time. My friend was the one like applying for grants and doing stuff like that. So I got to merge like then my experience in digital marketing in a nonprofit and doing that. And I was like, I love working with impact-driven like initiatives and, entrepreneurs. And that shaped me so much when I moved to the US. After working in digital broadcasting, understanding like, oh, I really want to work into that side of broadcasting, like helping people see their message, but also do quirky things. Because why not?
Yeah, dude, that's really cool. Like your story, who would have thought that all this was setting you up for where you are today? I guess that's kind of all of our stories at some point in time. Our past experience leads us to where we are. Okay, so yeah, you're doing that. You're in London, crushing it. It sounds like, and just having a lot of fun and learning a lot, which is honestly like one of the best parts of life is those experiences with those people that you knew back then. And I feel like when you're younger too, everything's so like exciting and new, and it's like you're doing like cool events and you're involved with the radio and everything is so like new and exciting. But okay, so you're doing that, and then eventually you meet your current husband, and you come to the U.S. There's some pieces in between, I'm sure. But so what was that like? Did you, as soon as you got here, were you like, I want to keep doing this? I want to keep working in this space, or did you have to pivot for a little bit while you guys got settled, or kind of what was that transition like?
Yeah, so when I left the UK, I was actually working for a nonprofit in digital marketing. So I really got to understand social media newsletters, and that's how I really understand a lot of how podcasting can complement and can work for small business owners, because you're like, you only have limited resources, you have limited budget, you can only do so much, right? So I was like, okay, I did that, but I really didn't like it. I was like, okay, like I have that skill set, but I wanted to go back to doing podcasting and, just everything that related to broadcasting. And so I moved here, we moved, and we had to start from scratch, but we were so lucky. When you're somewhere and things are like, well, I was doing online community radio, but like that wasn't necessarily like what was paying truly the bills. And so I was like, okay, like I know I love that, but I want to make sure that now it's the thing that pays the bills. So we got connected with a friend of a friend, and he's like, oh, I'm doing like this this department in a PR firm. We are creating the first like content streaming podcasting department, and we need someone who knows graphics design, knows social media, and can run shows. And I was like, this is perfect. That is me. So it was super interesting because we got to take the department from, this was when 2018 maybe, yeah, 2018. So podcasting was not yet exploding. It was still like, people were like, this is something, but there wasn't like a good roadmap. So we took the department from like having like 3 shows a month to having like, I don't know, maybe 50 shows, independent shows per month. It was wild. So we started with one simple studio. We were like testing things out, like, okay, how do we stream to Facebook? How do we stream to YouTube? Is this an audio only show? Like, what do we do? Into like, oh my gosh, now we have like 8 studios, and the team grew to like, I don't know how many people were, like maybe 12 people or something, or 8 people. So a lot more, right? And you're like, damn, this is big. But like anyone else, you take the time and you're like, I had a death in the family. Both my husband and I are European. And we thought, well, it's not going to work for me to, just have the 2 weeks a year vacation time. And I was like, I want to go back home more frequently. And so I was like, well, I guess I have to start my own company to be able to work from anywhere. And I was like, the more again, risk averse person, I don't know if I want to do that. But then I was like, let's see. Like, I am the kind of person who thinks I rather try it and fail than spend my whole life thinking, what if, right? Like, what if I tried it? Mm-hmm. And I think that we all have to assess how far are we willing to go, or for how long are we willing to go to try new things and see if they work. So for me, it was like, look, I have savings, and if I have savings and I can try this, why not? So January 2020, I launched my company, specifically working with entrepreneurs who are impact driven. So people who love to educate their community, mm-hmm. or their business idea is about making the world a better place. And I was like, yes, these are my people. And then, March happens, COVID happens. And I was like, oh, what are we doing?
Yeah, so, right after you launched. Wow. Yeah, that had to have been scary. That had to have kind of made you like second guess, right? To some extent. I mean, you were probably working from home, I guess, but all those relationships and stuff from the radio, you did the digital marketing. Now all of a sudden you can't go be with them or see them or see anybody. Well, it's probably in Texas. It was a lot more chill than here. Here it was like, it was down.
Yeah, we were locked down, but it was, it made me understand like, okay, what can I do from home, right? And because I'm not incredibly passionate about, producing content. I love talking to people. I love engaging with people in like, I was pretty much the person who guests remember me because I was like, what can I get you? You're a rock star. And then I was like, hey, like I have these list of people who I engage through time. Let's like reach out. So something that I think it's important for listeners to think about, especially if they're launching their podcast, is honestly, like, reach out to your dream guests. I reached out to people who I met and I was like, these are people that I would love to serve as a podcast producer and help them with their whole strategy. Let me talk to them. And it was so funny because they're like, actually, we still remember you and we want to start a podcast. So it was just have the guts to talk to people who you really think would be a good fit, even if it sounds unrealistic. And it may work. Like, I started my business and I approached a ton of people that all of them were good fits. And I'd say at the time, it was like a 60% success rate, which is really good.
That's good. Very good. Yeah.
And I lost some contracts that were about to be signed, but I also gained contracts that I was not expecting because people were like suddenly at home and they're like, what do I do? I guess I start a podcast finally. So that was really cool. And then I did that for about a year and a half. And I'm like, I want to get into the learning and like teaching, because I'm a teacher at heart. I love helping people. And so I started migrating my business into the online courses and more like consulting. And that has been what I've been doing since. And I just love it so much. So yeah, that has been such a windy road, but exciting though.
Well, no, I mean, you definitely have the personality for it. I think that, yeah, you enjoy working with people, and I'm sure like you're, infectious when they're working with you. And I think that's all really cool that you took that chance. And then the blessing and the curse of COVID is that, everyone had to like pivot or just come up with new ways to do things. And I think, that you were probably doing that, got the wheels turning. And you're like, I'm really meant to be like coaching people on their podcasts and consulting with them. And so that's awesome that you took that chance, and all that past experience led to kind of that moment, and then it all, that's where that's the podcast space. Was it called the podcast space back then? Or were you just
Yes.
Ana Xavier? Okay.
All right. So I launched the company. I knew that I was like, I don't want to be my own brand.
Yeah.
Because I actually initially I wanted to be an agency. So do the marketing, do the editing, do the show notes, do all the things, because I was like, I want to work and create a work environment that is exciting for people to have, something that is purposeful to work in, right? You want to work in something that excites you. And sometimes as a freelancer or as a, collaborator, you don't get to do exciting stuff. And I was like, I want to bring people that like I know are aligned, or that like maybe they're not working at something exciting, and I want them to be a part of this. So I knew that I wanted to create something that would be like bigger than me. And it's so funny because I was going to call it like, Eric, when I say that a lot of I am unconsciously competent at so many things, and branding is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember looking at I think I was going to call that like podcasting 360, like a boring name like that, right? And I was just, because I was like, oh, marketing, strategy, production, coaching, like it's like 360 is something that you need all
I
of it.
like that.
Right? It makes sense. and I go on to like look for the domains, and it's like $7,000 to buy this domain. And I'm like, I guess I'm gonna brainstorm something else. And then I just looked I was like, oh, the podcast space, and just like direct download from the universe right there. And I was just like, let me see if this is available. And the podcastspace.com was available, but podcastspace.com wasn't available. And I was like, I'll go with this. I just did it like that. All of the things, like my photography, all of these things were kind of like accidents. One of my good friends, she's a photographer. She goes, I have an opening tomorrow. Like, I have a slot. Do you want to take it for this discounted rate? And I'm like, sure, I'll need photos for my website. And that is one of the things that branding and looking professional just changes your branding online. So if you're a host and you're thinking, should I invest in branding photography? Yes. Or at least get like your very talented friend to do a photo shoot with you on the best iPhone you can find, right? Like, because it's the difference between looking like an amateur and being taken seriously as a podcaster or a business owner. So I knew that those things needed to be like the foundational, kind of like the first steps of my business, and really create a website. I know how to create a website. I'm not a developer, but I'm like, I know how to work these guys, because on podcasting, when you're like working in digital marketing, you have to
you
embed
learn so
things.
much. Yeah, you learn so much about like every little aspect of it.
So I was like, this is great. Like I love design and I love interior design. So like the background, if you're listening to this, you're not going to see this, but there's a cute neon sign, and there's my grandfather's recorder behind me, a tape recorder from the 50s that I hauled from Portugal on my suitcase, on my carry-on suitcase. Never again. Then there's like a cactus and like a deep green color that is part of my whole branding. So everything in my company has been really something that I was like, how can I blend what I love and really make it to the best of my, like, just take advantage of it, really. That's honestly like number one reason you will stand out from the crowd, is like really honing in everything that you're really good at and making your podcast like a part of it.
do you find that a lot of people you work with are so focused on just the podcast itself that they kind of forego the branding, or do they think branding is expensive, or like, I would love to hear some tips on like, people how to brand on a budget, or how to really create a brand that encompasses you. Because I agree, I think the brand is huge, and it's also like the first thing people see. And so if you're trying to stand out in this sea of tons and tons of people, it's definitely important. And I think it can be something that people neglect, especially starting out, because there's so much else they have to do that it's like, oh, well, I'll get to that later type of thing.
Right. Yeah, I think that branding is one of the main important things. It's funny that I always advise clients, create branding that one is consistent, like pick a font, like pick 2 or 3 fonts and stick with them.
Simple, very simple.
Pick 3 colors, stick with them. Like my main colors are yellow, white, and green. And I know that when I post on social media, people stop and recognize my brands, recognize my colors, recognize my fonts, and they engage with the content. So that's something that I will say. I have people at podcast events coming to me because I've been consistent for the past 3 years. They're like, oh my God, Anna, I love your stuff. How are you? Blah, blah, blah. Like, that's something that I think people really understand when you are serious about what you do. If you create content that looks professional. And again, Canva, do not overcomplicate it. Canva has
you
great
don't have to
stuff.
get crazy. It's easy. Canva, there's so much cool stuff you could do with like a click of a button. Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, like I even made my my podcast ID. I was gonna like go into lingo. My podcast intro and outro on Canva, because they have like sound effects and they integrate with YouTube. And so as long as you like connect your accounts, you're good with copyright. So I created something super simple, but looks really good and super slick. And I'm like, I'm not gonna craft something from scratch. I'm gonna go to Canva. So it's just really understanding less is more. And sticking to those 3 things, right? Like your colors, your fonts, and just like good photography. Do you want me to repeat that?
Yeah. Say it again. Sorry, I bumped it.
That's okay.
Good. Yeah.
So 3 things, right? So you want to make sure that your fonts are consistent, your colors are consistent, and you have really good photography. Because honestly, like selfies just kind of look a little amateur, right? Like, just it's so simple to not have an arm sticking out on a photo, right? And that just builds a lot of trust with a listener. And again, obviously, it comes down to quality in your content. So that's kind of like the outward facing. But the things when you're working on it, like making sure that your content looks cohesive, that it is something that you love talking about. Going back to your question, I kind of like went a little bit on a tangent. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's the thing. When you really enjoy the people that you're talking to, you're just like, man, we're just vibing.
For sure. That's what I like about podcasting. And I try to pick people for the show that we get that energy.
Yeah, for sure. So, thinking about like the big mistakes that podcasters do, apart from like not focusing on creating cohesive, like cohesive online identity, is trying to be someone else. Right? Those are like the intrinsic things. Like we think that we're not good enough. And so we try to copy, our competitors. I don't like using the word competitor because I think everybody has peers. Like I think of you as a peer. And I love that we got to collaborate. But I don't try to be you. I don't try to be someone else. I look at what are the things that people already say that I am great at and I really hone in that. And that's when you create an effortless brand online, because the person that you are individually and then professionally is the same. And so there's no persona, especially in radio. People having big personalities, but then when you meet them, they're like way toned down. I'm like, that's kind of like almost disappointing. So that's something that people always tell me, like, oh my gosh, like you're just like, I see your social media content, I see your podcast, and you're the same person. I'm like, yeah, like that's how you create a brand that feels authentic and true to yourself, because you're leaning in all your strengths. You're never thinking, am I being professional enough? Just like, I'm just being me. right? Like I'm being as professional as I would be talking to someone if I'm in a meeting or whatever, but I'm also making sure that they feel that I'm almost like their best friend that kind of happens to be an expert in podcasting, you know? And I think that that's like a really good starting point.
Yeah, I think too, like the way you're explaining it, it's like it almost kind of happens naturally, like being yourself and then, you know, incorporating that into the show. I will say though, do you think that like, what's your take on this? Because I think sometimes you get going, you maybe do like 6 episodes or 8 episodes, whatever it is. And then you start to realize like, oh, like I'm not sounding like I want to sound or pivoting with their vision or their vibe or their tonality. And the people that you work with, do you find that happens a lot, that they set out down one path and then once you start working with them, they really kind of hone in and be like, oh, like I need to make some changes or little tweaks that you give them and then that helps them improve and get closer to their goals?
Yeah, I think that it's important to understand that one, you're going to suck at some point. And like in some point of the journey, you're not going to be great. But also, if you start and you don't see any progress, that kind of is not good. Unless you're a professional already, right? Like where you all, but even professionals, we grow, right? I think that it's starting from a good point of understanding, okay, this is, you know, something I'm comfortable doing right now. But I know that when I get to episode 100, I'm going to look back. And I think that's a fun exercise to do, is just to listen back and just like go through the cringe, right? Like, and like, oh my God, I failed to do this thing, or I didn't. Like, you always have the chance to grow no matter what, right? So don't think that this episode has to be the best possible episode. I do what I like, combining really good episodes with the MVPs, like the minimum viable products, right? And I think that as a creator who's doing all the things, like I'm doing all the things for myself, sometimes the podcast, I finished listening and I was like, man, I misspoke here. I'm not going to record the podcast again. Everybody misspeaks. I misspeak even in conversations. And so I can take the show notes as an opportunity to say, hey, by the way, I mentioned this. That's not what I mean. Or sometimes I don't even mention it because people know what I'm saying. So it's just like, if you're focusing obsessively over that one thing, you're never going to create a podcast or an episode or whatever it is, right? So start with something that you're proud of, that you're like, okay, I set up the standard that I'm okay with publishing. And again, sometimes I just know not everyone, I'm not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but I'm okay with that because I don't listen to every podcast and think I love every podcast I hear. That's not the case. So I work with clients on figuring out like, okay, what are you comfortable doing? But really, it's all about the mindset. It's like, do you really think that your mission is about saying all these words correctly or whatever it is? No, you're like trying to help someone with their message, with, you know, the passion, making sure that they start really leaning into their strengths, or creating, like, for instance, something that I like doing is looking at the content and thinking, okay, what are what's called super episodes? I always make sure that the questions that the client always gets all the time are answered, or something that is their community has a big misconception about, that we create a ton of content around there, because then you can reuse that content time and time again when you're, you know, like in a conference or you're in a conversation. Oh, hang on, I have a podcast about that. Let me send it to you. Because then you're repurposing the podcast in more than just way. It's not just like for marketing. It's not for, you know, your website. It's really a part, an effective tool of your business. And honestly, saying like or every now and again, it's not gonna, you know, make someone be like, oh, cannot stand them, right?
Yeah, I edit some of mine out, but I leave them in. I say, I swear a lot too. And I initially wasn't sure if I initially didn't know how that was going to play for branding or professionalism, but now I just leave it in because I don't know how to talk without doing that. So.
Yeah, and it's almost like a mental like limitation. If you know you're like, damn, I can't say I cannot curse now. You're almost in a different state, and you're not going to be focused. You're going to be focusing on the wrong things. And again, people that want to do business with you, I swear a lot too. I don't swear a lot on my shows, but like in person, my husband's like, Anna, seriously. And I'm like, what? Studies show that people who curse are perceived as more authentic as people who never curse.
And
so,
then you
Eric, I'll say that.
Well, I think too, whether it's swearing or whatever kind of just little tick or a little personality trait that you have that you may not even know you're doing. I think people I think that's one of the things about podcasting is like people, they find their people, and there's something about you or me or whoever else that podcast that some people like. And like you said, not everyone's going to like you, but you'll find like the people that vibe with you and that feel that energy. And I think that's kind of one of like the ultimate goals really is to find those, to be yourself and present your content or your information in a way that obviously it's not like super unique. It's probably been said before, but you do it in your like unique way that people can relate to, and they like that.
Yeah, and I love what you said, because honestly, that's one of the main reasons people get stuck, because they're like, oh, my process or my concept is not unique enough. And I'm like, look, just go for the assumption that everything anyone has ever done has been done, like by someone, somewhere, or thought eventually through time. Like we are not creatives, 100%. Right? Like most people do not create something from scratch. We take inspiration consciously or unconsciously from something else. So knowing that, we're like, okay, I'm just going to give my perspective on that one thing. Just takes the pressure of just like, I have to create the most unique thing. Because it's not about that. It's about connecting in kind of like the most human way to someone else. And so giving our perspective on something is, you have shows that break the mold, sure. But in a way, I like to think that somebody thought about that eventually at some point. And maybe didn't act on it, but thought about that. So just thinking. But I'd love to ask you, Eric. Now, I'm like, ooh, I know that we didn't talk about this, but I'm like switching seats for a second. Like, what was your biggest insecurity before starting the show? Like things that you're like, should I go down this route? Like, is it safe for me to do that and still be perceived as a professional?
I think the biggest thing for me, well, it's two things really. One is like imposter syndrome, which I always struggle with big time. Like I was like, what makes me think that like, I should be talking about podcasting or coaching people? Like, I don't know that much. That's one. And then this other one, which is stupid, but for me, it makes sense is, so yeah, I'm from LA in a city called Burbank, which is kind of like a small town within LA. It's kind of got like this small town vibe. And this is so ridiculous, but the thought of like all my close friends and family like hearing the show and this is ridiculous, but yeah, just being insecure about that and like then also being insecure to like tell them about it and promote it to them. And everyone has their thing, but that was part of it. I knew I could get like a good recording. I knew I could edit and mix the shit out of it, like, and make it sound good. But it was just, and still even now, just like putting myself out there. I think too, because like as
you're the behind the scenes guy, right? As well.
Yeah, and I have a small team. I have a couple editors and stuff, but I think that it always does still feel like it's a very like solopreneur type of thing that I'm doing, and I think when it's just you. There's a lot more pressure for some reason. Like I played in bands my whole life and have toured and played on stage to hundreds of people, not really nervous at all. And I think that's because there was like a other band members or like a team. And this podcasting was the first thing that like I did solo. And I think that pressure and just that insecurity of like just me doing it was something that kind of held me back. I should have started years ago with this. It would have been like way further along.
I love hearing that, because I think that we all feel like an imposter unless we are completely. So there's like the 3 stages of being competent at something. You're unconsciously incompetent, which is how people who just like, you know what, I'm just going to start a podcast and figure it out. And sometimes these are the people that are wildly successful because they're like, they have no inhibitions. They're just like, whatever, like it's fine. And then there are people that are consciously competent at it, which is people who are like understanding like, oh, okay, like maybe I should start a podcast now because it makes sense for my next phase in my business. And there's people like you and I who are unconsciously competent at what we do, and we get into the imposter syndrome because we're like, we still don't know so much, and you're just like, oh man, like I can make this perfect, and like how will people perceive me? And then you get stuck into that, like, I know that like there's always so much more to do, but you already forget that you know so much, that you're so ahead of everybody else, but you still struggle with those emotions of like just thinking that like there's still so much on the road. So I can relate to that. We all feel like when you are like aware of your skill set and you know how to do things right, you kind of start feeling like an imposter because you're like, man, like I look up and there's still so much to aim for and all that. Like, am I ready? Like, maybe I should do more. So, and sometimes just a side note, like these are the small things that as creators, we're so afraid to put out there. And these are like the episodes that create the biggest connection with our listeners and with our viewers, because they finally get to see like a small side of us that isn't perfect. And they're like, oh man, like you too, you suffer from imposter syndrome. Yay, imposter syndrome crowd.
Yeah,
right?
That vulnerability, I think, anytime I'm listening to something and then, whether it's a host or some kind of show and they open up a little bit about this stuff, I think it's good. And I think it also just helps people, like as we're talking right now, people that listen to this, if they're at that point in their journey, just knowing that like everybody goes through that, and it's okay. You eventually, you learn from it and you grow, and, it's just part of the process. And some people, they might crush it from day one, and just those groups that you were talking about, people fall into one of those groups. It's interesting how that happens, Is that something that you, do you have to coach people through that, or are most of your clients, are they already past that, or is it a mixed bag of, people struggling with different things for their podcast?
Yeah, well, it kind of, normally I put people into buckets in terms of genders. So women or people who identify as female normally always tend to have a lot of insecurities, and men never have any insecurities. So we are already, in terms of society, primed already for, as women, to be like, oh, maybe I don't know enough, or maybe I shouldn't take space. And every man that I work with, they're like, okay, so how's this idea? When can we start?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So those two buckets of people, but by default, and again, I'm screwed because I primarily work with women. Sometimes I work with men, but primarily with women. And it's always that like, Anna, I'm insecure. And it's always like, I always advise them some things. I'm like, we really need to talk about this. And they're like, I'm not sure. And I'm like, let's talk about this. And then once that episode is out, either that becomes a super episode, or we like really notice like a change in how people are behaving, like the audience is engaging with the content. So there's always, I would say, 8 times out of 10, it's worth it to be a bit more vulnerable and really like try episodes you're unsure about. But normally, like people are a bit insecure, or they just like, it takes a minimum of 20 episodes to start building your confidence as a host. And solo episodes, man, I don't know about you, but like I always struggle to sell solo episodes to hosts, female hosts. They're like, what do you mean, me and the microphone and just the two of us? And I'm like, you need to be talking to the listener. I know it feels weird, but you have to do it. Like Oprah is probably the exception of like someone who is, but again, she also does like solo segments, right? Like she can get that one-on-one time with the viewer, and I think people think that, oh, I'll just be a great interviewer, and that's all that it takes to build trust with listeners. Like, not really.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the shows I work on, it's been running. It's called The Art of Charm. I'll say it. It's fine. It's been running, I think, since like 2004. There's various reincarnations of it, but one of the hosts was even saying, like, I don't want to just be known as like a good question asker or like a good like interviewer. Like I need to start, he was realizing that, he needs to start positioning himself more as like the expert or the authority, instead of just always, just being known as someone who's like a good conversationalist, which I think is also good. And that's part of podcasting. You want to hear someone as a host who's engaging with their guest. But the solo, so I just listened to your newest episode, about websites and so you do solo stuff too. I would like to know, like, do you find that hard, or do you prefer that? Do you find that harder? And like, what's your prep process just for people listening? Cause a lot of the audience here, they're new to starting podcasts and they're looking for, just different roadmaps, but like, do you script a lot out? Are you more you strike me as more like bullet point oriented and then just riffing, or like, what's your style?
Yeah. So, your guess was accurate. My podcast is a combination of, solo episodes with interviews. Now, first this is something that, like, again, sometimes I rather just connect with a host and the listener versus just like, all right, here's my talking point.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But for instance, something that I do love helping podcasters with is really assessing what is the goal for the podcast first, because there are about 7, right? And I'm going to say this not to you, but to the audience. You can do the show for networking reasons, which is how the majority of people do it. If you're a business owner, that's great. Content for your online business and marketing for, you know, like your social media, all of the things. Thought leadership, and that's when solo episodes come in hand. Then you have the sales, lead generation, career changing, and also as a passion project. So looking
I like
into
those buckets. I like that.
Yes. So looking at first, what do you want your show to do for you? And then assessing what type of content you need to create. You cannot be doing sales if all you talk about is other people and you never talk about your products and services, right? Or your skill set. So understanding first what the show is. And for me, my show had like a combination of 3. So I want to do more public speaking. So it was a way to, for myself, build that confidence on, you know, public speaking. I am an idea generator, so I have no need to start a podcast to create online content for my business because I already do that by default. And then, like, I also wanted to engage with other thought leaders in the industry. So networking. So I do interviews with people, and also like doing a little bit of lead gen for my business. So warming up listeners and understanding, okay, like from all the people that are there, Anna is the person that I connect best with. She really understands how I want to do the show, and I understand, you know, who she is as a professional. So I want to work with her. And for the solo episodes, I am again also someone who's like, I don't like video. I am behind the scenes. You know, like for years, I was like the behind the microphone. You can't see my face. And so one episode that I will be having coming up soon is about like actually like I have strabismus, which is when one of your eyes is going inward or outward, or both eyes, like depends on who you are. And to me, my journey, like as someone who, you know, got surgery when they were like a kid, I still like that's part of one of the things that I'm always self-aware when I take photos, like, oh, these eyes like looking slightly in or and it get in my head. So I was like, okay, what is a strategy that I'm going to use to be more visible? And I knew video was going to be something because I launched my company in 2020. Only in 2023, I finally decided to launch the podcast. So I started using my phone and like doing Insta stories. So video, talking to the camera in really short snippets of time. I knew if it was going to be terrible, it would disappear. So I built my confidence through that. And I think it's a great tool. And then eventually I was ready to do a video podcast and doing solo episodes. So doing reels, doing all of these things is preparing me through time to then become a more confident public speaker, but also like creating online and teaching people. So that was my journey. And I think that we all have our own journey and our own insecurities, but we can choose how to look at it instead of just hiding in the corner and be like, I'll never do video because someone one time in the internet may criticize me for like not having my 2 eyes looking at the same time. Like whatever, you know what I mean? It's just like, whatever, get over yourself.
Yeah, well, 2 things. One, I love that. I love like the type of content or the type of podcast, whether it's solo, whether it's interview, whether it's lead generation. Yeah, that whatever your goal is, that kind of determines the format of your podcast, and you can intermix things. But I love that. I love thinking of like what's the point of the podcast, what's the goal, and that helps shape the format of the episode. So that makes total sense. And then video, yeah, let's talk about video. Do people need a video podcast? I'm a little bit like you. I started with audio and then I was like, fuck, like, I guess I got to do video. I don't want to deal with it. It's so much easier for me to sit at my desk and my mic's all set up and just start recording audio. But then I was like, you know, discoverability and then clips and this and that. But then I don't know if the clips really drive listeners on the audio front. Do they just like the clips? And then anyway, that's a long way of saying like video. Yeah. What are your thoughts on it for social media and for like, yeah, YouTube podcasts? Like, let me know your philosophy.
Yeah. So I think that I never push anyone to do video if they don't want to do it, right? Like there's so many stories of podcasters who were like, no, I'm not doing video, and they're still successful. But I think it's understanding that it's hard to be discovered as a podcaster on audio format only, right? Like you just have to invest more time or more resources in other things. Maybe it's guesting on more shows. Maybe it's paying ads. So I will say video is important. Now, I will be super, super honest here. Like to me, audio is the best because you can, there's two things. The most important thing kind of like splits into two. One, when you're doing audio only, you're not splitting your attention. So like I'm looking at the camera right now. I have to be aware of my body language, my positioning, setting up, all the things. And two, it just takes more time. So like you have to be aware that it just takes more time. And if you mess up, like people will notice on the cuts, right? So that's like first, like the most important thing to know. And then second, really like it's more complex. You have to actually, I haven't done a ton of videos for social media, not for the podcast, because I was like, I don't feel it today. And so if I was to just record a podcast episode and do an audiogram or whatever it was, it doesn't matter. Like I just kind of pulled a microphone and just do it, right? So you have to get yourself in a mindset that is like, okay, this is going to be a bit more work, right?
Yeah. More
mentally like prepare and think about it, but also just like you're just like, it's in terms of energy, it just uses more of you. And for the first, I'd say 3 episodes, I was exhausted. I was talking to a friend of mine, Nick Redman, who would be a phenomenal guest on your show, by the way. She's a vocal coach. And she's an award-winning podcaster too. And we were talking about that, like how, like you strain, like you may, like the way you're positioning yourself. If you're podcasting, you're a bit more loose on audio format. But if it's video, you may want to position yourself differently, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And then like, it's just your whole body and adrenaline like just changes. And so you have to really be ready. And I was not ready, for the amount of energy. Like I was so depleted after recording 1 episode, also because I was super nervous. Podcasting is, you don't use it, you lose it, right? Like you can kind of start sucking as a podcast host if you don't do it frequently. Like it just, you need to practice the craft. And so for video podcasting, I mean, you can do so many things now. Like you can put your camera and if you don't want to stare at it, you can put it like slightly to the side. There's ways. But I'll say the future of podcasting, for most people, for the small business owner, I think there's only benefits to doing it on video, going on YouTube. Because there's 2 user paths on audio and video. Think about how you go on YouTube. You are ready. You have a question, you want an answer. Doesn't matter who answers it. But on audio platforms, you don't go on Spotify and be like, who's this random podcast? Let me listen to it.
Right.
So you're just not, you're maybe missing out on a growth. But again, if you don't invest and your effort and time, and I'm not talking about equipment, you don't need a ton of great equipment. Like you need good lighting. You don't need the best camera out there, because if you're not a techie person, I'm not a techie person. I just have my Elgato camera that like connects directly to my computer. I don't need interfaces. Everything connects to my computer. So I don't have stress about like, oh, this is not working, whatever. So make sure that whatever you're putting out there is good. And that's it.
Yeah, it's good. And like you said, for very little money, you can get like a setup that's good enough and that you don't have to stress about that. Because I think that part of it too is like, people, I got to get a camera. I don't know how to use a camera. But you're right. It is exhausting. You got to be aware of how you look. I wasn't going to put stuff in my hair today. And I was like, oh, I'm going to be on camera. Or like, yeah, your background, like I just have a door, like your background's great, but those are all things to be aware of. And yeah, you don't have to make everything perfect. You could get away with some stuff, but yeah, it's so funny. I was talking to a friend of mine named Travis Brown, and he's like,
oh, yeah, Travis.
Travis, did you follow him? Yeah. But he's like, a big proponent of video, which nowadays most people are, but he's like, the first thing people do when they wake up in the morning, they look at their phone, they scroll Instagram. Like you want to be there, even if they're not listening to your podcast per se, you want to be there they're going to keep you and your brand top of mind. So at the very least, it's important for that awareness and that discoverability of you and that you're the face of this brand. So yeah, Anna, circling back to your background, your international background, you speak several languages. I would love to get a little insight on the podcast landscape abroad. One, what that's like, and then two, if you're thinking about or if you're currently working in that space.
Yeah. So funny enough, I love this question because if your listeners are international, I will say that anyone who is in the US, who is in especially the US, because it's perceived as we're always ahead and trying new things or more adventurous. Again, major brands like, Apple, Spotify, they're based here. So in terms of perception, anyone back home is going to look at you and think, oh, wow, they're really ahead. And that has happened to me. I actually have a ton of Portuguese people who follow me, and they connect deeper on a level that is oh, okay, you're also Portuguese. So there's they already kind of it brings their guard down. But at the same time, you are physically where things happen. You're in the thick of it, right? So in terms of building confidence, I will say that I've seen, and I was actually having podcast power hours in Spanish as well. And because I do speak, it's fluent. So I'm I totally can do an analysis of a podcast in Spanish. I wouldn't say in French, but but I was thinking, I was yeah, the audience already perceives you as a thought leader. And when you're here in the US, you're just kind of it's that concept of, yeah. So you're it's
a rock star.
Yeah. So it's the concept of small fish in a big pond, or a big fish in a small pond, or whatever. So when you're a foreigner, you just, oh my God, again, it takes a lot of courage and a lot of resilience to let go of your support system and start your life somewhere else. So people already connect with you oh wow, even if you're not quote unquote making it, but you're trying, and that's inspirational. And again, the market for podcasting anywhere else other than the US is not as advanced, is not as shiny. We don't really understand how important it is to be aware of that privilege in a way, right? And so I have actually helped a ton of podcasters really stand out in their own field just because they were doing a podcast in English or whatever it was, right? So it is important to be aware of that, because the podcast scene is really different in Portugal and the UK. For instance, even going into how people speak in Portugal. And this was so interesting for me as someone in radio, right? Public communication. In Portugal, normally if you have a lisp, if you have an accent, your voice is a little more high pitched, you're not going to make it on the main radio stations, right? So moving to the UK, where there was, I can't remember her last name, but there was this host called Gemma, and she had a little bit of a lisp, and her voice was kind of slightly different. And I was I love that the BBC is featuring someone who has a speech impediment, or just all these different ways to look at it. I was oh my God, this is amazing. And then listening to podcasts in French, because my husband's French, and listening to just the way that they do the podcast, how they talk, the segments where they put them. It's just a different pace. And then in the US, where this is where everybody's trying something new and the concepts are really cool, and you just are surrounded by people who are doing adventurous things. So you therefore feel inspired to do it. So I've worked with people from the UK, Portugal, France, Norway, Serbia, and I have a big community in Australia, apparently. So yay. Yeah, and it's fun.
Would you ever do have you ever thought about a Portuguese podcast? I don't know. I feel you had to have thought about it. It's had to have crossed your mind, right?
Eric,
no?
I have to admit that my Portuguese is not as good as my English anymore, because if you don't use it, and I'm there are people I can switch, but it's just sometimes because I spend so much of my time speaking in English, my grammar accidentally already. I speak Portuguese with an English grammar, so it's weird.
Oh, it's backwards, right?
And so sometimes I'm
Yeah.
what is the word? What is the word in Portuguese? And my parents just laugh. And my friends just laugh. But yeah, no, I've actually been doing some work with Portugal, and because lucky enough in Portugal, we use a lot of English words anyway, just like as we speak. And so that's not a problem at all. But yeah, it's been really interesting because I'm like, man, like whenever we go back, it's going to be a learning curve. But yes, for sure. I thought about it, but I'm like, again, it's about like understanding your energy levels. And I'm like, well, I don't think I need it for now. Most Portuguese people speak English anyway. And it's been phenomenal to actually hear some of my community members say things like, Anna, I didn't speak much English, but like I started following you and my English started improving. And now I don't even watch you with subtitles on YouTube anymore. And I'm like, yes. And we have a little celebration. So that's really cool. And another reason why your content should be on YouTube is the subtitles, by the way.
Yeah, no, that's cool. That's cool that that person connected with you and like their English is better. I love that.
Yeah, that was cool.
Well, Anna, as we wrap up here, so the podcast space, what's next? What are you looking forward to? What's next? And what are you excited about just in the industry in general?
So I'm super excited to be focusing more on the e-learning and continuing to grow that. Something that I saw the other day was that HubSpot said that having a community was going to be a fundamental part of every brand's presence online. And so having some sort of program or a community or like a channel where your community can be, it's going to be something that is going to be huge this year. So I want to invite everybody to think about that if they don't have it. I already have a couple of courses that provide you that. So I launched a course that helps you really create content for your social media out of your podcast. So imagine creating one episode and the social media for the week is done, right? It's called Maximize Your Podcast Content. And it does come with monthly calls with me and other students to get into the mindset of like, okay, we're a group. I'm not by myself on my podcast journey, but also if I'm stuck, how do I get unstuck? So that's something that I have. And I do a lot of consulting on podcast power hours is always fun. Students come in, podcasters, they come in with their questions and boom, boom, boom. 60 minutes later, they're like having an action plan to, get unstuck on all the things they've been hesitating about. Don't have answers to. So connecting with me at thepodcastspace.com or on Instagram, I'm at thepodcastspace. And I would love to connect with people there.
All right, Anna, thank you for coming on the show. Go check Anna out. Check out her Instagram. She's putting out great content. We'll link to everything in the show notes. But appreciate you coming on, Anna. Your energy is infectious and it's good talking with you.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me and I love your show. So it's so phenomenal to be here.